The Atlanta sun beat down on my freshly washed Porsche 911 as I pulled into my driveway, finally home after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. Being a doctor wasn't glamorous, despite what those TV shows depict. It was exhausting, demanding, and often heartbreaking. The only respite I truly got was the drive home, the purr of the engine a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. That afternoon, however, peace was the last thing I found. As I unbuckled my seatbelt, I noticed Mrs. Henderson, my next-door neighbor, barreling across her lawn towards me, her face a mask of fury. Trailing behind her, like a sluggish shadow, was her son, Kevin. Kevin was, well, let's just say he was a permanent fixture on their couch. I'd heard snippets of their shouting matches throughout the years, always about Kevin's lack of ambition and Mrs. Henderson's enabling. I tried to be a good neighbor, offering a polite wave every now and then, but I mostly kept to myself. I liked my peace, and they were a constant source of drama. You, Mrs. Henderson shrieked, pointing a finger so accusatorially it felt like a physical blow. You think you're so high and mighty with your fancy car, don't you? I raised an eyebrow, completely bewildered. Mrs. Henderson, is everything all right? All right? No, nothing is all right. My Kevin here has been having a tough time. He's been feeling very low. She gestured dramatically towards Kevin, who was now staring at my car with a vacant expression. He needs a boost to pick me up. And I think you should give him that car. I blinked, trying to process the sheer audacity of her statement. Excuse me? Give him my car? Yes. It's only fair. You have so much, and Kevin has nothing. It would really help him get back on his feet. She puffed out her chest, as if daring me to disagree. It's the least you can do for your community. I couldn't help but laugh, a short, incredulous bark. Mrs. Henderson, I work incredibly hard for everything I have. I've poured years of my life into my education and my career. Why on earth would I just hand over my car to your son? Her face twisted into a grotesque sneer. Because he deserves it. He's a good boy. He just needs a chance. And you, with your fancy degrees and your... Her words trailed off, but the unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. I knew what she was thinking. I knew she saw a successful black man and, in her twisted worldview, believed I owed her something. No, Mrs. Henderson, I said firmly, my voice laced with steel. I will not be giving Kevin my car. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going inside. I reached for the door handle, hoping to end this absurd encounter. Oh, you think you can just walk away from this? She shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. You think you can flaunt your wealth and get away with it? I'm calling the police. I'm calling them right now. She fumbled in her purse, her fingers trembling as she pulled out her phone. I'm going to tell them you're harassing us, that you threatened my son. You just wait and see, you'll be in jail tonight. My stomach clenched as I watched Mrs. Henderson dial 911, her voice rising in a hysterical crescendo as she spoke to the operator. I knew this was going to escalate quickly. In that moment, I felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a bone-deep weariness. Dealing with unwarranted accusations and prejudice was a familiar burden, one I carried every day. But this was different. This was happening on my property, in my neighborhood, because I refused to give away something I had rightfully earned. Yes, hello. I'm being harassed by my neighbor, Parker Thomas, she screeched into the phone. He's flaunting his expensive car and threatening my son. He's refusing to help us, and I think he's dangerous. I think he might be dealing drugs. No evidence, but he's a doctor, and you know how they are. I could hear the blatant lies spewing from her mouth. The casual racism, the baseless accusations, it was all too predictable. The worst part was knowing that someone, somewhere, might believe her. She was weaponizing the system, using her privilege to try and tear me down. Kevin, meanwhile, stood silently beside his mother, occasionally glancing at my car with a mixture of envy and resentment. He hadn't said a word, but his presence felt like a tacit endorsement of his mother's behavior. After what felt like an eternity, she ended the call, her eyes blazing with triumphant malice. They're on their way, she announced, her voice dripping with venom. You'll be singing a different tune when you're behind bars. I sighed, trying to remain calm. I knew that panicking wouldn't help. I leaned against my car, crossing my arms and waiting. There was nothing else I could do. The waiting was agonizing. Every passing minute felt like an hour. I watched as other neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, curious about the commotion. I could imagine the whispers, the judgments forming in their minds. That's it, I thought. Everyone will act like they don't see this. My heart was beating rapidly in my chest, and my hands were starting to sweat. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, Sarah. I explained the situation as concisely as possible, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah, I need you here as soon as possible. Mrs. Henderson called the police and made some pretty wild accusations. I'm worried about how this is going to play out. Sarah was calm and reassuring. I'm on my way, Parker. Don't say anything to the police without me present. Just stay calm and tell them you want to wait for your lawyer. Her words were comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. I knew that even with Sarah by my side, there was no guarantee of a fair outcome. The system wasn't designed for that. I watched my neighbors' houses still peeking through the curtains. I was on my own. I just hoped that the police would see through Mrs. Henderson's lies and that this whole ordeal would come to an end quickly. But deep down, I knew it was just the beginning. The flashing lights of the police cruiser cut through the afternoon sun, painting the quiet suburban street in a dizzying array of red and blue. 2 officers emerged from the vehicle, their faces grim and professional. I recognized Officer Miller, a younger officer who had been on the force for a few years. I'd seen him around the neighborhood, always polite and approachable. The other officer, a seasoned veteran with a stern demeanor, I didn't recognize. Mrs. Henderson immediately rushed towards them, launching into a dramatic retelling of her version of events. She embellished the story with every breath, painting herself as the victim of my unprovoked aggression and portraying Kevin as an innocent bystander just trying to get his life back on track. Officer Miller listened patiently, his expression unreadable. The other officer, however, seemed less impressed. He glanced skeptically at Mrs. Henderson, then turned his gaze towards me. Mr. Thomas, he asked, his voice neutral. We received a call about a disturbance. Can you tell us what's going on? I took a deep breath, trying to remain as calm and collected as possible. Officer, my neighbor Mrs. Henderson is upset because I refused to give her son my car. She then proceeded to call 911 and make several false accusations against me. I provided a concise account of the afternoon's events, emphasizing Mrs. Henderson's unreasonable demands and her subsequent threats. I made sure to stick to the facts, avoiding any emotional language that could be misconstrued. Officer Miller nodded, taking notes in his notepad. The other officer continued to observe me, his eyes sharp and assessing. He then turned to Kevin, who was still standing silently beside his mother. Son, do you have anything to add? Kevin mumbled something unintelligible, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Henderson quickly interjected, speaking over him. He's just shaken up by this whole ordeal. He doesn't want any trouble. The officers exchanged a look. Officer Miller then approached my Porsche, circling it slowly. He examined the car closely, running his hand along the gleaming surface. Nice car, he commented, breaking the silence. Thank you, I replied. You work hard for it? Yes, sir. I do. He nodded again, then turned back to Mrs. Henderson. Ma'am, do you have any proof of these allegations you've made against Mr. Thomas? Any evidence that he threatened you or your son, or that he is involved in any illegal activities? Mrs. Henderson sputtered, her face turning a shade of purple. Well, no, not exactly proof, but I just have a feeling. He's a doctor driving a fancy car, living in this neighborhood. It just doesn't add up. The other officer sighed, clearly growing impatient. Ma'am, feelings are not enough to justify making false accusations. You understand that, right? The tension in the air was palpable. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken skepticism in their eyes. I knew that simply being innocent wasn't enough. I had to prove my innocence, had to dismantle the stereotypes and prejudices that Mrs. Henderson was so eagerly trying to exploit. Just as it seemed the police were beginning to see through Mrs. Henderson's charade, Kevin snapped. The pent-up frustration and entitlement that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. It's not fair, he roared, his voice cracking with rage. He doesn't deserve that car. He's just showing off. I deserve it more. I've had it so hard. He lunged towards my Porsche, kicking the side panel with a force that sent a visible dent into the pristine metal. The sound of the impact echoed through the neighborhood, silencing the onlookers who had been watching from their windows. Officer Miller immediately moved to restrain him, But Kevin resisted, thrashing wildly and screaming obscenities. "Get off me. I want that car. It's mine. He doesn't deserve it." The other officer quickly joined in, and together they managed to wrestle Kevin to the ground. It was a chaotic scene. The quiet suburban street transformed into a battleground. Mrs. Henderson stood by, wringing her hands and whimpering, her initial fury replaced with a look of dawning horror. "Kevin, stop it. What are you doing?" she cried, her voice laced with desperation. But Kevin was beyond reason. He continued to struggle against the officers, kicking and screaming, his face contorted with rage and frustration. Finally, they managed to handcuff him, his protests fading into a series of incoherent sobs. The officers helped him to his feet, his body trembling with exhaustion and humiliation. They led him towards the police cruiser, his head hung low. "He needs help," Mrs. Henderson pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not a bad person, he just needs help." Officer Miller turned to her, his expression stern. "Ma'am, your son just committed a criminal act. He damaged private property and resisted arrest. He will be charged accordingly." He then turned his attention back to me. "Mr. Thomas, are you pressing charges for the damage to your vehicle?" I hesitated for a moment. I knew that pressing charges would only exacerbate the situation, further entangling Kevin in the legal system. But the damage to my car was significant, and his behavior was completely unacceptable. "Yes, officer," I said finally. "I am pressing charges." The officers placed Kevin in the back of the cruiser, the doors slamming shut with a resounding thud. The vehicle idled for a moment, then slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving Mrs. Henderson standing alone on her lawn, her face etched with despair. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. The curious onlookers retreated back into their homes, their whispers replaced with a palpable sense of unease. The flashing lights of the police cruiser faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than ever before. As the police cruiser disappeared down the street, I stood staring at the dent in my Porsche, a physical manifestation of the absurdity and injustice I had just experienced. The initial shock and anger were beginning to subside, replaced by a deep sense of disappointment. I couldn't understand how someone could be so consumed by envy and entitlement that they would resort to such extreme measures. Mrs. Henderson's behavior was a blatant display of prejudice, fueled by her own insecurities and her misguided belief that I owed her something. And Kevin's violent outburst was a tragic consequence of his mother's enabling and his own inability to cope with his failures. Just then, I saw Sarah's car pull up to the curb. She got out quickly, her face etched with concern. "Parker, are you all right?" I heard sirens. "What happened?" I recounted the entire ordeal, from Mrs. Henderson's initial demands to Kevin's violent outburst and subsequent arrest. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing progressively angrier. "This is outrageous," she said, shaking her head. "I can't believe they actually called the police on you for refusing to give away your car. And the false accusations, it's just unbelievable." She examined the dent in my Porsche, her lips tightening with disapproval. "We'll get this fixed, Parker. And we'll make sure Mrs. Henderson is held accountable for her actions." Sarah immediately began to assess the situation, gathering information and documenting the damage to my car. She spoke to the remaining police officer, ensuring that my statement was properly recorded and that all the necessary evidence was collected. She then approached Mrs. Henderson, who was still standing on her lawn, staring blankly at the spot where the police cruiser had been. Sarah spoke to her calmly but firmly, explaining the legal consequences of her false accusations and the potential for further action if she continued to harass me. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, "you need to understand that your behavior was completely unacceptable. You cannot make false accusations against someone simply because you are envious of their success. And you certainly cannot encourage your son to damage private property." Mrs. Henderson remained silent, her eyes downcast. Whether she understood the gravity of her actions or not was difficult to say. But Sarah's words seemed to have some effect, as she didn't offer any resistance or further protests. After Sarah finished speaking with Mrs. Henderson, we went inside my house. The events of the day had left me feeling drained and emotionally raw. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, struggling to process everything that had happened. Sarah sat beside me, offering a comforting presence. "Parker, I know this was a difficult experience, but you handled it with grace and composure. You didn't let them provoke you, and you stood your ground." I managed a weak smile. It's just tiring, Sarah. Having to constantly defend myself against these kind of accusations. It feels like I'm always having to prove myself to justify my success. I know, she said, squeezing my hand. It's not fair. But you can't let their negativity define you. You have worked hard for everything you have, and you deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor. We spent the next few hours discussing the legal options available to me. Sarah explained that I could file a civil suit against Mrs. Henderson for defamation and property damage. She also suggested that I consider obtaining a restraining order to prevent her from further harassing me. Ultimately, I decided to pursue both options. I wanted to send a clear message that her behavior was unacceptable and that I would not tolerate any further attempts to undermine my life. The next few weeks were filled with legal paperwork, court appearances, and meetings with Sarah. It was a stressful and time-consuming process, but I knew it was necessary to protect myself and my property. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. Mrs. Henderson was ordered to pay for the damages to my Porsche and was issued a restraining order, preventing her from coming within a certain distance of my property. Kevin, as previously mentioned, had to face charges of damage of property. The whole ordeal left a bad taste in my mouth, but ultimately, I used it as a reminder of how hard I had worked and continued to work to avoid such conflicts. Over time, the neighborhood returned to normal. The whispers faded, and life moved on. I continued to live my life, focusing on my work and my passions. The dent in my Porsche was eventually repaired, but the memory of that day remained. It served as a reminder of the prejudice and entitlement that still exist in the world. However, it also reminded me of my own strength and resilience, and the importance of standing up for what is right. And it was a reminder that, eventually, the truth prevails.